welcome to episode 2 of cybersecurity discussions between Ideal Integrations, Blue Bastion, and Henderson Brothers. These roundtables are designed to address critical areas of security protocols, risk management, and financing strategies in short segments. Today's topic, Colonial Pipeline. Colonial Pipeline, the existence of groups like DarkSide, and the vulnerability of public and private infrastructure. Today I have Corey Bussard, Luke McOmie from Blue Bastion, Dan Coast, and Peter Horne from Henderson Brothers to discuss this topic. First question I have for everybody. The compromise and ransom of the Colonial Pipeline caused quite a stir in May. Corey and Luke, what exactly happened and how could this infrastructure attack have been prevented?
So I'll go first, if you don't mind, Luke. So first and foremost, Colonial Pipeline was by what we now know is the DarkSide group. They had many different ways to gain initial compromise, from password reuse to phishing campaigns, and even an attack that focused on a vulnerability with sonic walls themselves. So there's a couple things. Obviously, hygiene, right? I think the number one key that I'm going to talk about is going to be hygiene. Hygiene being a variety of things, right? From checking for vulnerabilities and ensuring that you are actively remediating the ones that make the most sense, that are highly exploitable or being exploited in the wild, if and where you can. Also, ensuring due diligence against your passwords, ensuring that you have good passwords, and doing dual factor everywhere that you can. And then obviously you're always going to be combating against phishing campaigns. And then some of the other things that we saw as part of that attack in the chain of events, from initial compromise all the way through them completing their mission of dropping ransomware. A lot of steps could have been prevented just with OS hardening, right? Things like LSA protection, things like LLM&R being disabled, enabling SMB signing. All of these things are more standard towards OS hardening techniques. So with that, I'll turn it over to Luke for the rest.
I think that one of the things that we found that was really interesting, not only did they have multiple points of initial vectors of how they got on and how they were doing this stuff, I thought that one of the more interesting things about this attack were all of the various tactics that they used to try to not get, picked up, right? They had scripts that before deploying any of the malicious software, before really getting a deep foothold on a lot of these systems, they're doing things like looking, is there endpoint detection running on this system? What types of software are in place? Do they have something that's going to potentially pick this up and stop us from being able to go through? The other thing I thought was interesting is how they staged this out, right? It was that initial point of contact, and then they very, very quietly attempted lateral movement and other types of things to gain that foothold and to move through the environment. It really staged and had a solid hold on that environment before anyone ever really knew what was going on, right? This is before they'd ever deployed any of the crypto lockers or before they had deleted backups, before they had, started relaxing permissions on file shares so that they could exfiltrate additional information. Those types of things tend to be really noisy, and they were smart about kind of sitting around and understanding and making sure that they had the data and the information they needed before they pulled that trigger. Another good indicator of the maturity, really, of where this group is at, and going back to some of our previous discussions, like from our last webcast where we talked about malware as a service, this is another good example of a professional group who's doing exactly that.
So what I got out of those answers is a few things. One is that, that everybody should be aware that the attacks, especially moving forward, are only going to get more methodical, and it's not going to be the everyday person. And even if it is that everyday person has access to tools that are not everyday, right? That are basically put together by a very well-organized group that is multi-phase, multi-method of attack, internal, external. I know that, DDoS was a part of those attacks as well. So, and the other part that I got was when we talked about, well, how do we avoid these types of attacks? There is no silver bullet. It has to be multiple ways, both internally protecting your network, like you said, Luke, on the last episode, talking about visibility and lateral movement within your network, and then also externally from a networking perspective with DDoS, et cetera. So it's a lot of different things. And this is only going to get more complicated as time goes on because the tools are only going to get better. So
I think the hacking of a pipeline is indicative of the complexity, right? I mean, this is a major pipeline from Louisiana to New Jersey, largest in the eastern part of the US. And they had all the technical tools that you three just described. And, it was an infrastructure job. It's not like, a single office in Atlanta or a single office in New Orleans that they just locked up. I mean, it was a pipeline that spanned, 20 states.
Here's another thing to consider too, and we talked about this concept of systemic risk. Colonial Pipeline in and of itself had the breach, but think about all the companies that they interface with.
Yeah.
Airports, trucking organizations, all these different transportation and supply chain businesses that could have been impacted by this breach that weren't. So we actually kind of got lucky in this situation. It could have been substantially worse had that migrated out into these companies. So there's this concept of systemic risk is what is really causing the change in the cyber insurance world as well.
Dan, the Wall Street Journal interviewed the CEO of Colonial Pipeline earlier this week and asked that man, why did you pay the ransom? Why did you want to get this encryption key to, try to regain access to your system? And his main response, among other things, was, we are a supplier, a connection to all these other types of companies, cities, states, other government entities. And they basically said, we would have crippled things far more than they already were, if we didn't pay, I think it was the time, over $4 million in Bitcoin just to start the process of restoration.
Right. And maybe a lot of people don't realize that just paying the ransom is only the beginning, and there's a lot of other.
He admitted that the key gave them 1/3 of the capabilities they needed to regain what they needed.
Not so simple. One more thing, and this will lead into my the second question. I think that the important thing to also point out here is, you're pushing for better security and better measures to protect your infrastructure, and that is a struggle, across the board. And now we're getting into things that delve into IoT and security of IoT. And so I do want to comment, or maybe get some comments from the panel on that, on how do we protect IoT, that we're getting in that realm. And then the next question, we can all kind of comment on this. Most people don't think about cyber liability policies when, we're talking about a pipeline, a factory, or other piece of infrastructure is shut down. But I'd like to discuss how would cyber liability respond to property damage or bodily injury? And can you give us some examples? And that's directed toward Dan. And then the panel can comment on the IoT side of things as well.
So I guess I'll go first relative to your question, Michael, and I'll turn it back to Corey and Luke on the IoT. Relative to, a pipeline, and again, let's turn the clock back a few years ago. Well, I'm not a retailer. I'm not a healthcare organization with all these records, right? Those are the folks that really, that you thought that's where the risk lied. Anybody that has data is a risk. We know that now, right? If you have data, if you're a business, you have a risk. Because if you can't access your data, you're now disrupted. Relative to transportation companies, relative to anybody in supply chain, Colonial, I think, is an absolute wake-up call to all businesses now that realize the risk. And so when we have a breach, I mentioned earlier, we have a business interruption loss. This is where, again, looking at your cyber policy and looking at, okay, let's do a tabletop exercise and see if we have a breach, what is this potential impact going to be, not only on first party costs around forensics and ransom, but what's the business interruption loss to us if we have this situation? What's our restoration period? How long will we be back up and running? So that's where you need to be constantly working that plan, having an incident response plan, and working that plan continually to understand it. So that's, I guess, part one of the response. And then relative to, how does a cyber policy respond to bodily injury and property damage? This is, I think, an evolving area of the cyber market. Most cyber insurers are probably not going to offer bodily injury or property damage coverage carte blanche on a cyber policy, but there are opportunities to get endorsements where we could build in contingent contingent bodily injury and contingent property damage that would be caused by a breach. I liken this to a manufacturing company, and there's a breach into their manufacturing systems that then cause some type of power surge or something to fry their manufacturing equipment, right? So now we've got a property damage relative to the causation of the breach. So there's a lot of things to consider here. And I think paying attention to the evolution of cyber coverage as these things materialize.
So in that light, Corey, Luke, before we close, some comments on how the shift to security, or how much should we be looking at IoT in addition to just data, as Dan was talking about.
So I just want to, I'm almost to the point. I think I'm going to blurt these two things out if I don't say them yet. One is, so for the IoT side of the fence, the first part there is awareness, a CMDB, asset inventory. So you can't assess what your risk is if you don't even know that something's on your network. So that's part one to what I wanted to kind of hit head on is, I think starting with what do you have in your network, having a very good asset inventory against it, and then being able to understand what that means to you, what those solutions are running underneath the hood, right? So if you're using some IoT device and it's based upon some old firmware of some old version of Linux that has been vulnerable for the last 15 years, that's probably something you should know. And then number two, I actually can't believe it's taken me this long to say it, but going back to some things that Dan said, we really need to talk about DR, and everything needs to be in DR. It can't just be, there's no longer just servers have a DR plan, in my opinion. We need to start talking about how can we start protecting everything with a DR plan, right? Think about your IoTs. If you're a manufacturer and you have this one piece of equipment or multiple manufacturing devices that, let's say, for example, and just for ease of math here, we'll throw out a number. If that manufacturing piece of equipment goes down for a day, you lose $1 million. You should probably have some type of a disaster recovery plan surrounding that device. And that device could be an IoT thing. It could be a old manufacturing thing. It could be a variety. It could be IT. It could be OT. It could be anywhere in between. But we really need to start thinking about, number one, how can we understand everything that's on our network in a very methodical approach and methodical way? And then how can we have a disaster recovery plan around that? And with that, I'll turn it over to Luke to answer the rest.
No, you're definitely thinking on the same terms and the same path that I am. I think that one of the things we need to bring up that a lot of people don't, it doesn't come to mind when they think about IoT, is these are computers, right? Whether it's your coffee machine that is networked, whether it's a refrigerator that you've got plugged in, whether it's a phone, like a IP phone, all of these different devices have an IP address. They are an embedded system. They do have computers running in them. So, you can't overlook them, to your point about knowing what's out there. I think the other thing that's interesting is that in a lot of these systems, to your point of the 15-year Linux vulnerability, they are embedded where this stuff is literally flashed to a chip inside of the computer, right? A physical computer chip. So it's not something where you can just connect to the internet and attach to Microsoft Update and expect that they're going to push these updates to your system. So you have to be aware of that and have plans around, how long is this stuff going to be in your environment? How are you going to maintain it? When are you going to sunset it? How is it going to be removed? If it is attacked, how are you going to isolate it and be able to deal with these different types of things? Because absolutely, these devices can be used as an initial point into the environment. When you look at a lot of the attacks that we see that are happening around IoT type devices, I think that the biggest thing that scares me is not that people are getting hacked and that hundreds of thousands of these devices have been compromised out there and are being used for things like DOS attacks and other types of things. It's that I think we're going to start seeing an ever advancing, more complex way of being able to leverage these devices within the environments. And when you look at stuff like pipelines, electrical, water, any of these types of public utility, a lot of them are very susceptible to these types of attacks.
So
Skynet.
Right.
So we're going to be wrapping up now. Does anyone have any closing comments?
Nope.
Okay. If not, I want to thank everybody for joining us today. Luke, Corey, Pete, Dan, appreciate your insight on today's topic. This is the second episode of a continued series. So keep looking out for the next episode, and thank everybody for watching. And I'm Michael Stratos from Ideal Integrations. Stay safe.